And this project actually began for me, as most of my good ideas do, during a commercial break of The Daily Show with Jon Stewart. I stumbled across this commercial that I'm going to show you in just a second, and it kind of stopped me in my tracks. It was particularly interesting at the time, and so we'll just kind of jump in and give you guys a sense of what I'm talking about before we kind of begin with the paper.
Can you tell us what you remember about the battle?
We'd been fighting for a while. On the 7th day, we ran out of ammo. We had to scavenge all we could from the weapons that had been left behind. The pistols, shotgun rounds, a handful of grenades.
Do you remember where you were?
When Master Chief armed his grenade, I was in the back of an overturned warthog firing an M41.
How did you manage to keep it together?
We knew Master Chief was still in the fight. He gave us hope.
So, interesting commercial. A little bit different than your kind of average commercial for advertising a video game. It still kind of gets me every time. But you know, the question that kind of first popped into my head was, what is the mechanism, right? The social mechanism that's allowing for this kind of fluidity between a representation of a game character, you know, in kind of this digital format, and this real live human body. They've kind of become interchangeable in the context of these commercials. It's the only way it works. It's the only way it becomes legible for the consumer. And so I set out to kind of, you know, discover this mechanism. I'm an anthropologist, so I'm lazy. I don't come up with my own ideas. I talk to people and take their ideas. And so I talked to 21 Halo players. Unfortunately, they were all male in terms of the sampling that I got, but a range of ages. And the first thing that they threw back at me, something that we've been hitting on a lot, narrative, right? But it wasn't the normal kind of narrative you read about in a book, right? It had this interactive component that we talk a lot about. So I borrow kind of this conventional definition of narrative from Paul Ricoeur. It's very helpful, you'll see in just a second, when we begin talking about video games, because it allows us to do some interesting kind of turns on classical interpretation of narrative. But basically, he talks about the sense of narrative as compared to the durée of time, right? This experience of chronological time of being or doing something. So it's a compression of experiences where certain aspects are turned up and certain aspects are turned down. And then he talks about reference as another kind of way of categorizing narrative, and he sees two kinds of narrative: historical narrative and fictional narrative. Historical narrative tries to trace its reference points through documents and accounts, and tries to be literal, truthful, if you will. Whereas a fiction is a deliberate act of suspension of these things. The interesting thing about narrative for Ricoeur is that they kind of cross-reference the same moments in history, the same cultural phenomena, right? They come from the same place. They deal with that moment in which they arise in a very different way. And so in combining this kind of theory of narrative with a little bit of work from Paul Virilio, who does some very interesting kind of, thinking about seeing in relationship to machines, I kind of hypothesized this narrative machine, is what I call it. Thinking of Halo in particular, but games in general, as a narrative machine, that are a little bit different than traditional forms of narrative, because they kind of produce a narrative in duplicity or multiplicity, in that the sense alters between experience and a narrative sense, right? Sometimes we're playing, sometimes we're being told a story in games. And that also the way in which a game creates reference, it traces its reference, is particularly unique. Because the act of the game, right, the moments of the game's story are fiction, right? This is Halo, we're shooting aliens, this is not real life. But at the same time, there's a very concrete, almost historical, right, trace of the video game. You can kind of quantify or map the controls that a player takes and their course through the game, a physical interaction with a thing that's in your hand. It's real. And so I hypothesized that this kind of duplicity or multiplicity of the narrative is something that's particularly unique and begins a kind of interesting point for asking questions anthropologically about the impact of these video games on culture. The second mechanism that my respondents gave to me was this idea of reiteration or repetition. And it really, again, encompasses two concepts here. The first is that the game can be played repetitively. But even when we play a game repetitively, the experience is never quite the same each time. And this kind of collection of experiences creates a sense of depth to the game, of realness to the game, a very kind of seductive idea of exploring every part of the game, right? Seeing the whole story, experiencing the whole world. But reiteration takes another form when it kind of moves, when the narrative moves off of the game, right, offline. And we talk about kind of these distribution kind of channels of transmedial narration, if you will. And what I mean by that is we often see fan fiction coming out of these things, right? User-generated content. There's kind of a universe, as the respondents kind of described to me, of Halo that exists beyond the game. And that information kind of feeds back into the game. It creates a sense of kind of largeness, but it also produces itself. With multiple authors kind of coming up with a lot of this content, it almost seems autopoetic. It almost seems to kind of be emerging from nowhere in particular. And that you also have this element in which the, I apologize. And there's also this element that these kind of narrations of the game in this kind of large transmedial scale reflect the way in which we kind of tell our news stories, right? And that kind of symmetry creates this sense of hyperreality, in which the game world and the kind of real world enter into this teleological or cyclical relationship with one another, right? A fiction that kind of becomes lived as a reality. And as the game kind of moves into this temporal domain that's consistent with reality, there's kind of this imbrication. They kind of become almost inseparable from each other. And I just want to kind of point to some of the ways in which that this was exploited in an advertising context to kind of really touch on players' relationship with this game in the real world that I find just particularly interesting.
Now people were starting to see Halo as a story with real emotion and Master Chief as a hero who personified courage, duty, and sacrifice. And they saw it all over the world, in all the ways a hero would be honored. In a fictional war photography exhibit that you could visit online and in person, in street murals and on buildings, outside on commemorative plaques, on their mail, and in person at the world tour of the diorama. The blogs and forums lit up with talk about Halo 3, and not just from Halo fans. Each new release of a veteran's testimonial was eagerly anticipated. Online views of the TV spot and the web films reached over 40 million, and as the idea took hold, people began to find ways of honoring Master Chief the hero in their own ways. Pre-orders soared and became the fastest pre-selling game in history. And on its first day, Halo 3's $170 million day beat records set by Hollywood champs Spider-Man 3 and novel Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, moving Halo 3 from being the biggest launch in video game history to being the biggest launch in all of entertainment history. Halo 3 had become more than a game, it had become a worldwide cultural phenomenon. All people needed to do was believe.
So I leave that last point in there about the kind of profits that this game made in such a short period of time to make a kind of very real, tangible cultural point. This worked as an advertisement campaign. I argue that it worked because it resonates with something that's inside players, right? It's reflecting some part of their conception or understanding of this game. So where does this kind of all lead us? Well, it really starts to challenge a lot of these ideas that anthropology has about kind of modern culture. For me, I think it calls into question an idea of identity and also what we begin to consider what counts as real. And so I kind of put forward in the paper this idea of an identity as story, or self as story. It really should say self as narrative to be consistent, but I can't give up on the alliteration as the advertiser. But so it's not so much this kind of idea of the self as a story that one tells to oneself, right? This kind of idea of a consistent narrative, but that the self literally is a story, a collection of kind of narratives that intertwine Jeremy, who's giving the next talk, actually does a great job at kind of discussing these intersections of, you know, this distributed self. So I'm going to leave that to him. But really what kind of emerges out of this is very promising for me as an anthropologist, and promising in terms of kind of cultural development, is this idea that Don was discussing earlier, this idea of, you know, experience that's kind of not really consequential, in the sense that you can jump off a ravine, right, but not kill yourself. Now that's a very kind of concrete example. It doesn't inspire a lot of thought development, but I think that there's something deeper in this idea of experience without consequence that's particularly useful in terms of talking about culture, and kind of promising in terms of video game studies in general. I welcome kind of criticisms and comments at this time.
Okay, some questions? There's not questions. Okay.
No, I wondered, did the people who did the advertising, did they do any empirical research to find out exactly what of the success of the project itself, the film, or the object itself was caused by the flow of the advertising out into the...
Yeah.
And the other question I had was, that there was a kind of a special quality on that video that was, the advertising video that was shown, because it was a real actor impersonating an animated creature in the film or from the game. So was that a kind of a special selling point for the film itself, or...
Yeah, so
the game itself, I mean.
To kind of address the points in order, the first piece is that this campaign actually won a Cannes Lion, which is kind of a very big deal in advertising in terms of its effectiveness and creativity in what's called integrated media. So a campaign that works not just on television, right, but has components that function across. It's very difficult to kind of get that specific information out of a company. I tried, and they never kind of wrote me back. And you know, there's kind of confidentiality around that information, but I think absolutely. I mean, the longer version of that case study talks, you know, that the point was to not just get gamers, but to get people who were not gamers involved in this campaign, and that they really saw it as a success in terms of kind of extending the gaming audience. And I think it's particular to Halo in that regard. It's not a niche game; it's a pretty popular game.
It's become quite famous.
Absolutely. And you know, to that second point, I really think so. I think there's something, when you talk to the respondents about this, they see this as very much in the style of a war documentary. They feel like they owe these people something. It's this interesting playing with emotions, because it's not just this inversion of, you know, this digital representation and real, you know, bodied representation, but there's also an element of you know, a history of the future, if you will, which is another interesting concept. I never quite kind of was able to fully unpack that. I haven't quite fully unpacked, you know, what is that obsession with this history of the future. And I think you see a lot of that in games and in good advertising around games.
One interesting point about that piece with the actor and with the real life actor was that it's kind of like he's reflecting on a memory of a past traumatic event, which was also an event which had a social aspect for him, and companionship and all this kind of stuff. So, but it was referring to something completely virtual, and that's a very original kind of link. A memory of an imagined happening in the past, a fictional happening, which is realized by a real person remembering it, who wasn't actually didn't actually take part.
And it speaks to something of the kind of flexible relationships of time within the, you know, the medium, I think.
Thank you very much for the very interesting talk. I'm interested in time and difference and repetition events. Patrick has actually preempted my question I was about to ask about memory and how memory actually kind of, you're looking at the anthropology and the construction of culture, and stories and the self is story. So how does memory kind of actually build or kind of, intervene in the creation of the self is story? And what is the memory? And, is it a memory of a memory? And, I can replay a saved game again and again. And how does that memory kind of come into your participants, responses and construct the identity and the narrative and everything basically around it. So, yep.
Memory is definitely something that came up a lot with the respondents. Not only memories of kind of this gameplay, but memories of the narrative as being something a little bit different than maybe a story I've read or a book I've read. And I mean, I have to go home and do some more thinking because a lot of the things we've been talking about have really kind of given me some clues as to why that might be. And kind of considering this new kind of experience, this kind of immersion, and right, a lot of what we've been talking about.
I thought there was this material kind of, basically material expression of that memory in that statue that you showed us there. I mean, it's something that you can never, it's just there. The Master Chief remembered in certain ways, in whatever. And there's a cultural parameter as well, a comparison with someone else who's, very.
Yeah, there's another interesting element to this where they created all of these artifacts. Artifacts, we should use that term kind of lightly in this instance, but right, creating these representations that were supposed to be archaeological, right, of this this future historical event, right. Something very interesting in terms of playing with these ideas of what symbolically represents history to us, which I think is just an interesting spotlight.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Yes, I was curious about your conception of time here, because you referred to Virilio, but just quite shortly, if I wasn't asleep. And so I'm curious how you interpret Virilio, especially when he talks about the shrinking of space. With a focus on real time, as he phrases it, and how you combine that with what you referred to as the teleological principle of Baudrillard. What is the telos here? Is the telos the self as this story, and in representing that story, you shrink the spatial dimension and order this telos story of the self along this real-time axis? Or is there any other way you combine this really Baudrillard theoretical frame? Or am I wrong about both?
No, you've made a kind of an interesting point here where maybe teleology is the wrong kind of word to use, but maybe more of a sense of a hermeneutic of kind of, one understanding, interpreting another experience, then kind of replaying in this circle of understandings. That's probably problematic use of the word teleology. With regard to the shrinking of time and space, or of time, right, and its kind of impacts on space, shrinking of space.
And then you get real time, according to the video.
Absolutely. That's a little bit kind of, I dive into that a little deeper in the paper, in particular, but I see this kind of, the respondents address this idea of kind of narrative shape, which is kind of loosely interpreted for me in regards to this idea of space, of kind of movement through something, which has a lot to do with this idea of this kind of shrinking of time, this real-time piece that Virilio talks about. And then I also think that kind of extended beyond the game experience, but this kind of evolving culture and this kind of evolving knowledge base that exists around this game in particular, has a lot to do with that sense of creating a space, of creating a real space. I don't know if that addresses.
Yeah, because, well, I was curious about your take.
Yeah.
So that's okay.
Yeah, thank you. I must admit I haven't been following this particular campaign sort of after it came out, but I was just curious as of doing anthropological research about this. It seems to me that there's a significant difference between this kind of narrative self-a story that the commercial presents with all its interesting fictional whatever it is, and the stuff that Gordon presented us with, namely narratives constructed by the individuals in relation to game worlds and game characters and these things. Did you at all sort of probe that distinction between, excuse my, well, you know, prefab experiences such as this one? Were there Halo players that actually sort of engaged with this after the launch and thought of this as interesting sort of after the hype period?
Yeah, actually, there were some of the players I talked to had never seen any of this. They were, you know, set on buying the game, and they didn't, you know, they weren't kind of impacted by the advertising at all. They hadn't been aware of it, and it kind of was very emotionally stirring for them in their own words when they kind of saw it. It felt, the word that they use is, you know, it felt like I had done something significant in terms of playing these games, that we had been really fighting for something real. You know, these are the kinds of things that you hear, that we had kind of accomplished something. We had pushed back this, you know, evil force, right, trying to kind of destroy humankind. It was a very strange moment, and I'm not fully sure what to make of it, but, you know, Gordon's work in particular, I think, has given me something to kind of take home and maybe unpack this idea a little bit more of, you know, kind of what's really happening to be, yeah. Thank you.